Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Caleb Hunt returned to his family's farm after a year away, he expected to find the quiet sanctuary of his childhood. Instead, he discovered an industrial site tearing through his ancestral land. What began as shock soon turned into a battle for justice, legacy, and the fight to reclaim what was rightfully his. Caleb Hunt gripped the steering wheel of his battered pickup truck, the rhythmic hum of tires on the gravel road pulling him into a sense of nostalgia. It had been a year since he'd last driven this way, through the quiet countryside and towards the family farm that had been his sanctuary growing up. For 4 generations, the Hunt family had cultivated these lands, transforming what was once an unremarkable patch of earth into a thriving homestead. For Caleb, it wasn't just land, it was legacy. The truck creaked to a stop near the familiar weathered wooden gate. Hunt Family Farm, the sign read, its paint faded, but the letters still proud. Caleb stepped out, the late afternoon sun warming his face, and took a moment to absorb the view. The rolling fields, lined with sturdy oaks, stretched as far as his eyes could see. The scent of freshly tilled soil mingled with the crisp countryside air, bringing with it memories of childhood summers spent chasing fireflies and harvesting crops with his father. But something felt different. The stillness that once defined this place was broken by an unfamiliar sound, a distant mechanical hum. It was faint but persistent, carried on the breeze from the far end of the property. Caleb frowned, straining to place it. The last time he was here, the fields were vibrant, golden with wheat swaying in the wind. Yet now, as he looked closer, there was a barren stretch in the distance, its earthy tones jarring against the surrounding green. Curiosity tugged at him, but first he needed to reconnect with the home that had been left in the care of a neighboring friend. Caleb walked up to the house, its once vibrant red facade now dulled by time. Inside, the air was still, carrying the faint scent of wood polish and something older, perhaps the weight of memories left undisturbed. Photographs of his ancestors lined the walls, their stern faces a reminder of the resilience it had taken to build and sustain this farm. He set his bag down in the living room and stepped out onto the porch, unable to shake the unease that had settled over him since arriving. The hum, now louder, seemed to resonate from the edge of the property. Caleb squinted, catching a metallic glint in the distance. It wasn't a tractor. He would recognize that sound anywhere. This was different, industrial, and utterly out of place in the serene rural landscape. Curiosity turned into apprehension. He climbed back into his truck and drove down the familiar dirt paths towards the source of the disturbance. The bumpy ride only heightened his sense of unease as his mind raced through possibilities. Was it a neighboring farm expanding its operations? Perhaps a new development encroaching on the land? Whatever it was, Caleb felt an instinctual need to confront it head-on. As the truck crested a hill, the source of the sound came into view. Caleb's chest tightened at the sight. In place of the once fertile fields stood a hulking steel structure. It loomed against the horizon, its industrial edges starkly contrasting the natural beauty surrounding it. Pipes jutted out like skeletal limbs, and heavy machinery trundled across the dirt, leaving deep gouges in the earth. The hum of machinery grew louder, drowning out the natural symphony of chirping crickets and rustling leaves. This wasn't just a disturbance, it was an invasion. Caleb brought the truck to a stop, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. A mix of disbelief and anger bubbled within him. This land had been theirs for generations, untouched by modern sprawl. How could something like this have happened? He stepped out of the truck, boots crunching on the gravel, and stood frozen, staring at the structure that loomed over what should have been his family's proudest field. His heart sank as he noticed the damage around the site. Torn irrigation systems, trampled soil, and the remnants of the wheat field that once flourished here. Someone had treated this land, his land, like it was nothing more than a blank canvas for their industrial ambitions. Caleb knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let this go unanswered. Caleb's boots sank into the soft, churned soil as he approached the structure, each step weighing heavier with unease. The hum of machinery grew louder, and the acrid smell of diesel fuel, mixed with something chemical, stung his nose. What had once been fertile land now resembled a construction site, marred by deep tire tracks and scattered debris. The irrigation pipes, which his grandfather had carefully installed decades ago, lay twisted and broken like forgotten relics of a better time. The industrial building itself was small but imposing, with a steel exterior that gleamed harshly in the sunlight. Bright yellow warning signs lined the chain-link fence that encircled it, their bold letters screaming, "Authorized personnel only," and "Keep out." Trucks loaded with equipment rumbled past him, kicking up dust as they navigated makeshift paths carved through what used to be a flourishing wheat field. Caleb's jaw tightened as he took it all in. Who had authorized this? His family had meticulously maintained ownership of this land for generations, ensuring that it stayed out of corporate hands. And yet, here was this unwelcome monstrosity, built without his knowledge or consent. He approached the fence, gripping the cold steel of the gate. A laminated sign was attached to it, emblazoned with the logo of a company he didn't recognize. Green Core Modules, building a sustainable tomorrow. Beneath the logo was a tagline that made Caleb's stomach turn. Innovative solutions, infinite potential. Sustainable. The destruction around him told a very different story. A security guard emerged from a small booth near the entrance. Stocky and stern-faced, he crossed his arms as he approached. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his tone clipped and unfriendly. "This is my land," Caleb said, his voice steady but laced with anger. "What is this place? And who gave you permission to be here?" The guard raised an eyebrow, giving Caleb a dismissive once-over. "Sir, this is private property. If you don't have clearance, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Caleb's temper flared. "Private property? You're standing on my property. This land has been in my family for over a century. Now, I suggest you explain who authorized this." The guard shifted uncomfortably, but held his ground. "Look, I'm just doing my job. If you've got questions, take it up with management. I can't help you." Before Caleb could press further, a foreman in a hard hat approached, clipboard in hand. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking between Caleb and the guard. "This man claims this is his property," the guard said flatly. The foreman gave Caleb an incredulous look before consulting his clipboard. "This site belongs to Green Core Modules. We have all the necessary permits from the HOA, so unless you're here on their behalf, I'm afraid you're mistaken." Caleb's confusion deepened. HOA. He didn't live in a subdivision or planned community. His farm was independent, outside the reach of any homeowners association. "You've got the wrong information," Caleb said firmly. "This land doesn't fall under any HOA's jurisdiction. Show me your permits." The foreman hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Caleb's demand. "Look, buddy," he said after a moment, "I don't have time for this. We've got a schedule to keep, and as far as I know, everything's in order. If you've got a problem, take it up with the HOA board." Caleb's frustration boiled over as he watched the foreman walk away, barking orders at workers. The guard returned to his post, leaving Caleb standing at the gate, staring at the industrial site that had swallowed his family's heritage. Feeling cornered but determined, Caleb retreated to his truck, his mind racing. The mention of the HOA struck him as odd, almost laughable. How could they have claimed authority over land that was never part of their governance? Something wasn't adding up, and Caleb knew he needed answers. Driving back to the farmhouse, he pulled out the old deed to the property, carefully stored in a fireproof box his mother had given him. The yellowed parchment clearly marked the boundaries of his land, and there was no mention of any HOA involvement. With the evidence in hand, Caleb made a series of calls to the county clerk, to the planning commission, to anyone who might be able to shed light on how this atrocity had been allowed. But the answers were slow in coming. Most officials seemed disinterested, shuffling him between departments or claiming the matter was beyond their scope. Caleb felt the growing weight of helplessness pressing down on him, but he refused to give up. As he pored over the maps and deeds late into the evening, one thing became clear. Someone, somewhere, had manipulated the system to claim authority over his land, and Caleb intended to find out who. Caleb's frustration deepened as every phone call led to a dead end. The county clerk confirmed that his property had been erroneously marked as part of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, but no one could explain how or when the change had occurred. "It must have been during the last zoning update," an official suggested vaguely, as if the mishap were just an innocent oversight. Yet Caleb knew better. This wasn't just bureaucracy gone wrong. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Caleb drove to the Oak Ridge HOA's office the next morning. Located in the heart of a nearby planned community, the building stood out with its overly polished exterior and perfectly trimmed hedges. It felt like the antithesis of everything his family farm represented. The receptionist, a young woman with a forced smile, directed Caleb to the HOA president's office. Inside, he found himself face to face with Karen Mason, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp features and an air of superiority that filled the room before she even spoke. She gestured for him to sit, her polished nails tapping against her desk impatiently. "How can I help you, Mr. Hunt?" she said, her tone dripping with feigned politeness. Caleb wasted no time. "I need to know why my property is listed under your HOA's jurisdiction. It never has been, and I have the documents to prove it." Karen didn't blink. "Oak Ridge HOA absorbed your land during a regional expansion 2 years ago. It's all above board." She slid a folder across the desk containing what appeared to be legal agreements and zoning documents. Caleb flipped through the papers, his heart sinking as he saw his property's details listed under Oak Ridge's boundaries. "This can't be right," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I've lived on that land my whole life. No one informed me of any expansion." Karen gave him a condescending smile. "We sent notices to all affected properties. It's not our fault if you didn't respond. As for the development on your land, it's perfectly legal. Green Core Modules approached us with a mutually beneficial proposal. They pay us a maintenance fee, and we grant them use of the space. It's a win-win." "A win-win?" Caleb snapped, his anger bubbling over. "You destroyed my fields, ruined my irrigation systems, and built an industrial plant on land that doesn't even belong to you. That's theft." Karen's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, leaning back in her chair. "Mr. Hunt, I understand this is upsetting, but you should have kept up with your correspondence. If you have a complaint, take it up with the courts." Realizing he wouldn't get any further with her, Caleb left the office, his mind racing. Back at the farmhouse, he laid out the papers Karen had given him next to his family's deeds. The discrepancies were glaring, but unraveling the truth would require help. Caleb called his lawyer, Sarah Connor, who specialized in property disputes. Within hours, she found multiple irregularities in the documents Karen had provided. "This expansion reeks of fraud," Sarah said during their meeting. "HOAs can't just annex land without clear consent from property owners. We'll need to dig deeper." Sarah requested additional records from the county and discovered a critical detail. The HOA's expansion had been pushed through after a single meeting with no public notice. Even more damning, emails between Karen and Green Core Modules revealed their agreement to expedite the development in exchange for hefty contributions to the HOA's operating budget. The scheme was unraveling fast. Green Core Modules had moved in under the guise of legality, but Karen had orchestrated the entire process to enrich the HOA, and likely herself. Armed with this knowledge, Caleb and Sarah began preparing for the fight of their lives. Caleb leaned over the spread of documents on his kitchen table, each sheet a damning piece of evidence against the Oak Ridge HOA and Green Core Modules. His lawyer, Sarah Connor, sat across from him, her expression focused and determined. "We have enough to make a case," she said, flipping through the emails they had uncovered. "But to win this, we'll need to go beyond paperwork. We need witnesses, proof of intent, and evidence of the damage they've caused." Determined to gather everything they needed, Caleb started by reaching out to his neighbors. His first stop was the home of Frank Andrews, who had lived next door for decades and knew the history of the area better than anyone. Over coffee, Frank shared his own suspicions about the HOA's shady practices. "Karen's been muscling people into compliance for years," Frank said. "Most folks just give in because they don't want the trouble. But this, annexing your land, that's a new low." Frank provided Caleb with old maps and photos showing the farm's original boundaries, further proving that it had never been part of the HOA. He also agreed to testify if the case went to court. Encouraged by Frank's support, Caleb continued visiting neighbors, many of whom shared their own grievances about Karen's heavy-handed leadership. Meanwhile, Sarah pursued leads on Green Core Modules. She discovered the company had a history of exploiting loopholes to establish facilities on contested land. In one instance, they had been forced to shut down operations in another county after a similar case exposed their unethical practices. Armed with this information, Sarah contacted a former Green Core employee who agreed to speak off the record. "They knew your land was an HOA property," the whistleblower revealed, but Karen assured them she could smooth things over if anyone complained. Back on the farm, Caleb focused on documenting the physical damage. He photographed the ruined fields, the torn irrigation systems, and the deep tire tracks that scarred the land. With a drone borrowed from Frank, he captured aerial footage of the industrial site, highlighting the extent of the intrusion. As the days went on, Caleb felt the community rallying around him. Frank organized a small meeting of neighbors where Caleb presented his findings. "This isn't just about me," he told them. "If we let this go, what's to stop them from taking more?" The group agreed to write statements supporting Caleb's claim, adding weight to the case Sarah was building. The final piece came unexpectedly. Sarah received a tip from a clerk in the county office who had stumbled upon an internal memo from 2 years ago. The memo detailed Karen's push to have Caleb's land reclassified as HOA property, despite objections from lower-level staff. "She bullied her way through," the clerk said in a hushed phone call, and Green Corps was in on it from the start. With mounting evidence and growing community support, Caleb felt the tide turning in his favor, but he knew this was only the beginning. The next step would be taking the fight to court, where Karen and Green Corps modules would finally have to answer for their actions. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as Caleb took his seat beside Sarah, his lawyer. Across the aisle, Karen Mason sat stiffly in a tailored blazer, her expression cold and impassive. Beside her, the Green Corps module's legal team shuffled papers and whispered in hushed tones, their confidence radiating through the room. It was David versus Goliath, and Caleb felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. As the proceedings began, Sarah wasted no time laying out the core of their case. She presented the original deed to Caleb's land, which explicitly excluded any HOA involvement. "This land has been in Mr. Hunt's family for over a century," she stated, her voice firm. "Its inclusion in the Oak Ridge HOA's jurisdiction was an unlawful overreach orchestrated by its president, Karen Mason, and exploited by Green Corps modules." The first few hours of the trial focused on the documents Caleb and Sarah had gathered. Sarah presented the old maps, the forged zoning records, and, most damning of all, the internal emails between Karen and Green Corps' executives. In these emails, Sarah explained, pointing to a large projection of the documents, Karen Mason explicitly promises expedited access to the land in exchange for substantial financial contributions to the HOA's discretionary fund. Karen's lawyer attempted to counter, claiming that the HOA had acted in the community's best interest and that any mistakes were administrative oversights. But the evidence was piling up. Sarah called the former Green Corps employee to the stand, who testified about the company's history of cutting corners and their awareness of the dubious legality of the project. Next came Caleb. Taking a deep breath, he recounted the history of the land, his family's connection to it, and the devastation he had discovered upon returning. "This land isn't just property to me," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the tension. "It's my family's legacy. They treated it like it was theirs to take, with no regard for the damage they caused." Photos and drone footage of the destruction were shown to the court, leaving many in the gallery visibly shaken. Sarah emphasized the environmental damage, arguing that Green Corps' actions not only violated property laws, but also caused irreparable harm to the land's ecosystem. Then came the defense. Karen's lawyer painted Caleb as an absentee landowner who had neglected his property, suggesting the HOA's intervention had been necessary. The inclusion of this land into the HOA was done under the assumption that it was abandoned, the lawyer argued. "Our client acted in good faith." Sarah pounced on this claim. "Good faith?" she repeated, her tone razor sharp. "Let's talk about good faith." She pulled up the county clerk's memo, which documented Karen's aggressive lobbying to reclassify Caleb's land despite warnings from staff. This wasn't an innocent mistake. This was a calculated act to seize land and profit from it. The turning point came when Sarah presented a final piece of evidence, a recording of Karen at an HOA meeting, gleefully boasting about the financial windfall the Green Corps deal would bring. "They're paying us enough to fix the pool, repave the roads, and still have money left over," Karen had said in the recording. The courtroom fell silent as the judge listened, his expression hardening. In her closing argument, Sarah summarized the case with precision. "This isn't just about Mr. Hunt's land. It's about holding those in power accountable for their greed and deceit. Karen Mason and Green Corps modules colluded to steal land, destroy property, and profit at the expense of justice. We ask the court to make this right." After days of deliberation, the verdict was delivered. The judge ruled decisively in Caleb's favor, declaring the annexation of his land illegal and void. Green Corps Modules was ordered to cease operations immediately, dismantle their facility, and pay for the restoration of the damaged land. Karen Mason was held personally liable for her role in the fraud, facing fines and the loss of her position as HOA president. As the judge banged his gavel, Caleb felt a wave of relief wash over him. Justice had prevailed, but the fight wasn't over yet. The land needed to heal, just as his faith in the system had begun to recover. For the first time in months, Caleb allowed himself to hope. The heavy machinery that once marred Caleb's fields was now dismantling the steel structure of the Green Corps Modules facility. For weeks, trucks came and went, hauling away the debris of what had been an unwelcome blight on his family's land. Standing at the edge of the property, Caleb watched with quiet satisfaction as the last remnants of the industrial intrusion were removed, leaving behind scarred but promising soil. The court's ruling had been decisive. Not only was Green Corps Modules ordered to dismantle their operation, but they were also required to pay for a full restoration of the land. Specialized environmental contractors arrived with heavy equipment and expertise, replacing the irrigation systems, treating the contaminated soil, and preparing the fields for new crops. Meanwhile, the Oak Ridge HOA faced its own reckoning. Karen Mason had been ousted from her position and fined heavily for her role in the fraud. Her name became synonymous with corruption in the community, and the HOA was placed under the scrutiny of an independent auditor appointed by the court. The board, once filled with Karen's allies, now included reform-minded residents determined to restore trust and transparency. Despite the victory, Caleb knew the journey wasn't over. Restoring the land would take time, patience, and effort. He worked alongside the restoration team, ensuring every detail was handled with care. When the contractors finished their work, neighbors began to arrive, offering their time and support. Frank, ever loyal, brought his tractor to help reseed the fields. Others pitched in with labor, tools, and words of encouragement. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Caleb stood with Frank by the newly restored irrigation system. "Looks like the land's got a fighting chance now," Frank said, clapping Caleb on the shoulder. "It's not just the land," Caleb replied, a small smile breaking through the fatigue on his face. "It's everything it stands for." The community's response had been overwhelming. Caleb had initially thought the battle was his alone, but the neighbors' unity had shown him the strength of collective action. Together, they had not only reclaimed the land, but also rekindled a sense of shared purpose. By the end of the season, the fields began to show signs of life. Small green shoots pushed through the soil, a hopeful symbol of renewal. Caleb felt a weight lift from his chest as he stood on the porch of his farmhouse one quiet evening, gazing out at the horizon. The land was healing, and so was he. The first signs of dawn cast a golden light across the fields as Caleb stood on the farmhouse porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands. The land stretched before him, quiet but alive, a patchwork of freshly planted crops and revitalized soil. The scars left by Green Corps' machinery were nearly gone, replaced by the promise of a thriving future. For the first time in over a year, the sight filled Caleb with peace. The journey to this moment hadn't been easy. The legal battle, the restoration work, and the emotional toll had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Yet standing here now, he felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond personal victory. The farm was more than property. It was his family's story, etched into every corner of the land. And now it was ready to write a new chapter. The community had rallied behind him in ways he never expected. Neighbors who had once been distant were now steadfast allies, united by a shared determination to protect what mattered. The defeat of Karen Mason and her corrupt HOA leadership had sparked a wave of reform. New board members had been elected, and they were already working to rebuild trust and create a fair, transparent system. Even Green Corps' failure had sent ripples far beyond the farm. News of the trial had drawn public attention, turning Caleb's fight into a symbol of standing up to corporate greed and local corruption. Other landowners in nearby communities began challenging similar overreaches, inspired by Caleb's determination. As the weeks passed, Caleb found himself reconnecting with the farm in ways he hadn't since childhood. He spent his days tending to the new crops, repairing old equipment, and planning for the seasons ahead. The land was healing, but so was he. One sunny afternoon, a group of neighbors gathered at the farm to celebrate its revival. Frank grilled burgers while children played in the restored fields. Laughter and the hum of conversation filled the air. Caleb found himself surrounded by people who had once been strangers, but now felt like an extended family. As the evening settled into dusk, Frank raised a glass and called for everyone's attention. To Caleb, he said, his voice steady and proud, "For showing us that standing your ground is worth it, no matter how tough the fight." Caleb felt a flush of humility as the group erupted into cheers. Raising his own glass, he said, "To all of you, this wasn't just my fight, it was ours. And together, we made sure this land stayed what it's always been, a home." The crowd clinked glasses, the moment resonating with hope and unity. Later that night, Caleb stood alone in the fields, the stars brilliant against the inky sky. The soft rustle of the crops in the breeze was a familiar melody, one he hadn't realized how much he missed. He knelt and pressed his hand into the soil, feeling its cool strength. This land, his family's legacy, was alive again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as it always did, but Caleb knew one thing for certain. He was home, and the future was his to shape.